I didn't think anything was wrong that night. We had just finished dinner. The table still warm, the smell of food lingering in the air like any other family gathering. They were smiling, laughing, talking about ordinary things. And I remember thinking for a moment that everything was finally okay, that maybe all the tension I had been feeling for weeks was just in my head. But later that night, when I picked up my phone and opened my bank account, I felt something in my chest drop so fast it didn't even feel real, because everything I had saved, everything I had built over years was gone. I'm not the kind of person who jumps to conclusions. I've lived long enough to know that most problems have explanations, that sometimes what looks like a betrayal is just a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared. And that's exactly what I tried to tell myself in those first few seconds, staring at that number on the screen, refreshing it again and again like somehow it would fix itself. Zero. Not reduced, not delayed, gone. Completely gone. And the worst part wasn't just the money. It was the timing. It was a fact that just hours before, I had been sitting at the same table with the only people who knew anything about my life. That's when a quiet thought started forming in the back of my mind, one I didn't want to face but couldn't ignore. That dinner had been my idea. I was the one who called everyone, who insisted we all sit together like we used to before things started changing, before conversations became shorter and visits felt more like obligations and genuine moments. I remember standing in the kitchen earlier that day, preparing everything slowly, carefully, almost like I was trying to recreate something that had already slipped away. My son arrived first, quieter than usual, giving me a quick hug that felt more automatic than emotional. Then she walked in my daughter-in-law with that same controlled smile she always wore, polite enough to pass as kindness, but distant enough to never feel real. And still, I ignored it. I told myself that maybe I was overthinking again, that maybe this was just how people change over time. We sat down, plates filled, voices overlapping, small talk filling the space where real conversations used to exist. At some point, my grandson laughed at something his mother said, and for a brief second, I felt something soften inside me, like maybe things weren't as broken as they seemed. But then I noticed something else subtle, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. The way she glanced at my phone when I left it on the table. The way my son asked casually about my finances, something he had never done before. It wasn't direct. It wasn't obvious. But it was enough to leave a mark in my mind, like a detail that didn't belong to the moment. I didn't react. I didn't question anything. I just kept eating, nodding, pretending everything was normal. Because sometimes it's easier to ignore a feeling than confront what it might mean. Dinner ended like any other. They helped clear the table, said goodbye, and left. I stood there for a few seconds after the door closed, listening to the silence settle back into the house. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. There was something off, something I couldn't explain yet. And still, I went to bed thinking it was nothing. Just another night, just another family dinner, not knowing that in a few hours, something I couldn't undo had already happened. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, not because of any noise or alarm, but because of a strange discomfort I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't pain, and it wasn't exactly anxiety either. It was more like a quiet pressure sitting in my chest, as if something inside me already knew that something wasn't right. The house was silent. The kind of silence that feels heavier than usual, like it's holding something back. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few seconds, staring at nothing, trying to shake off that feeling, telling myself it was just another day. But that thought didn't last long. I picked up my phone almost out of habit, scrolling without thinking, checking the time, a few messages, nothing unusual. And then, without any real reason, I opened my bank app. It wasn't something I normally did first thing in the morning. In fact, I rarely checked it unless I had something specific to do. But that day, something pushed me to open it. And the moment the screen loaded, everything inside me went still. For a second, I thought it was a glitch. The number didn't make sense. It was too clean, too absolute. Zero. Not a reduction, not a suspicious transaction, not a delay. Just nothing. Like everything that had been there the day before had simply disappeared. I blinked, refreshed the page, closed the app, and opened again, as if repeating the action would somehow bring reality back to what it was supposed to be. But it didn't change. It stayed the same. Empty. That's when my breathing started to shift. Slow at first, then uneven. My fingers tightened around the phone as I scrolled to the transaction history, searching for something, anything, that could explain what I was seeing. And then I found it. A transfer. A single transaction, large enough to wipe everything. The timestamp, late at night, after dinner, after they had left. I stared at that line for what felt like minutes, maybe longer, trying to process it without jumping to conclusions, because that's what I've always done. I don't react fast. I think. I analyze. I give things the benefit of the doubt. But there was one detail that made that almost impossible to do. The access. This wasn't a random breach. It wasn't some distant scam. Whoever did this didn't break in. They logged in. And suddenly, the dinner from a night before didn't feel normal anymore. The questions, the looks, the small details I had ignored started rearranging themselves into something else. Something I didn't want to name yet. Something I wasn't ready to face. But it was there, clear enough to feel, even if I refused to say it out loud. I sat there, phone still in my hand, the room completely quiet, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't know what to do next. I didn't move right away. For a few seconds, I just sat there, staring at the screen, as if staying still would somehow slow everything down. But it didn't. The number didn't change. The transaction didn't disappear. And that quiet pressure I had felt when I woke up, it started turning into something else. Something sharper, more urgent. I stood up almost automatically and walked into the kitchen, phone still in my hand, like I needed to be somewhere else to think clearly. The first thing I did was call the bank. Not because I believed it was a mistake anymore, but because I needed someone to say it was. The automated voice felt colder than usual, every option slower than it should have been, every second stretching longer than it had any right to. When I finally got through to a real person, I explained everything carefully, choosing my words, trying to stay calm, trying not to let the weight of what I was feeling slip into my voice. I gave them my details, confirmed my identity, waited. There was a pause on the other end. Not long, but long enough. The kind of pause that doesn't reassure you. The kind that makes you realize something is already wrong before anyone says it out loud. And then the voice came back, controlled, professional, but different, more cautious. They told me the transaction had been authorized, not flagged, not suspicious. Authorized, from a recognized device, from a location that didn't trigger any alerts. I felt something inside me drop again, but this time it didn't come with confusion. It came with clarity, because that detail changed everything. This wasn't someone forcing their way in. This was someone walking through the front door with the key. I asked them to repeat it, not because I didn't hear it, but because I needed to be absolutely sure I wasn't misunderstanding. And they did. Same answer, same tone, no hesitation, authorized access. No signs of external breach. I thanked them, ended the call, and for a moment I just stood there in the middle of the kitchen, not moving, not thinking, just letting that information settle into something real. And that's when the memory hit me, not as a full realization, but as a fragment. My phone on the table, the screen lighting up, her eyes, just for a second, resting on it longer than necessary. At the time, it meant nothing. It was just a glance, something small, something easy to ignore. But now, it didn't feel small anymore. I walked back to the table slowly, almost retracing the night before without meaning to. The same chair, the same place where everything had seemed normal. And suddenly, it didn't feel like a memory anymore. It felt like a scene I had misunderstood, like I had been present, but not aware of what was really happening. I picked up the phone again, Opened the app, stared at the transaction one more time. The amount, the time, the finality of it. And for the first time, a thought formed clearly enough that I couldn't push it away. This wasn't random. And deep down, I already knew that. I didn't call them right away. That was the first instinct, but I held back. Not because I didn't want answers, but because something inside me told me that if I asked the wrong question too early, I might lose a chance to see what was really happening. So instead, I did something simpler, something neutral. I sent a message, just a normal message, casual, the kind that doesn't raise suspicion. Hey, hope you got home safe last night. I stare at the screen after sending it, watching those small indicators that show when someone is typing or when they've seen your message. Minutes passed. Nothing, which by itself wasn't unusual. People get busy. People don't always respond immediately. But that morning, every minute felt different. It wasn't just waiting anymore. It was observing. After a while, my son replied, "Yeah, everything's fine." Why? That last word didn't sit right. It was small, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. But it changed the tone completely. I hadn't asked anything that required a why. I hadn't hinted at any problem. And yet, there it was, a question behind my message that I never asked. I read it again, slowly. Why? And for a moment, I just held the phone, letting that single word echo louder than it should have. Because sometimes it's not what people say. It's what they assume you're about to say. I replied carefully. Nothing. Just checking. Another pause. This one longer. And then nothing. No follow-up. No explanation. No normal conversation. Just silence. That's when something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not yet. But awareness. The kind that makes you stop giving people the benefit of the doubt and start paying attention to patterns instead of words. I decided not to push further. Not yet, because whatever this was, it wasn't going to reveal itself through direct questions. If anything, it would hide. It would close off. And I needed the opposite. I needed it to unfold. So I waited. Hours passed, but that quiet tension didn't leave. It stayed there, under everything I did, like a background noise I couldn't turn off. I tried to distract myself, moving around the house, doing small things, but my mind kept circling back to the same point. The transaction, the timing, the access, and then, sometime in the afternoon, my phone lit up again. This time it was her, a message I wasn't expecting. Short, controlled. "Did you check your bank today?" I didn't open it immediately. I just looked at the notification on the screen, reading it over and over again without touching it, because that message didn't ask if everything was okay. It didn't express concern. It didn't even pretend not to know. It went straight to the point. And in that moment, something became very clear. She already knew. I didn't answer her message right away. In fact, I didn't even open it for a while. I just stood there, holding the phone, staring at those few words on the screen as if they carried more weight than they should, because they did. That was a message someone sends out of concern. It wasn't casual. It wasn't random. It was precise, direct, almost calculated. And the more I looked at it, the more one thing became impossible to ignore. She wasn't asking a question to find out something. She was asking because she already knew the answer. When I finally opened the message, I read it slowly, as if changing the speed would somehow change the meaning. "Did you check your bank today?" No hesitation, no emotion, no attempt to soften it. Just a straight line, placed exactly where it needed to be. And that's when I understood something that made my chest tighten in a different way than before. This wasn't panic on her side. This wasn't fear of being discovered. This was something else entirely. Control. The kind of control that only exists when someone believes they are ahead of you, when they think they've already shaped the situation enough that your reaction no longer matters. I sat down again at the same table where we had dinner the night before, the same place where everything had seemed normal, and for a moment, I allowed myself to replay every detail with a different perspective. The way she moved around the house, the way she stayed close to my phone without touching it. The questions that didn't feel like questions at the time, but now sounded like pieces of something else. And the more I revisited those moments, the more they stopped feeling like coincidences and started feeling like preparation. I typed a response, then erased it. Typed again, changed the words, erased it again. Because this wasn't just about replying anymore. This was about positioning. If I reacted too quickly, I would confirm what she already expected, that I had seen everything, that I was panicking, that I was trying to understand something she had already controlled. But if I stayed too silent, I risked losing whatever small advantage I still had. So I chose something in between, something neutral, something that revealed nothing. Yes. Why? I stared at the message before sending it, making sure there was nothing in those 2 words that could give away what I was really thinking. Then I pressed send and waited. This time, I didn't feel anxious. I felt focused, because now I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was watching. The reply came faster than before. Just asking. That was it. No explanation. No follow-up. Just enough to maintain distance, but not enough to close a conversation. And that confirmed something even more important than anything else that had happened so far. She wasn't trying to hide. Not completely. She was managing the situation, testing how much I knew, how I would respond, how far she could go before I pushed back. I placed the phone on the table slowly, letting that realization settle into something solid. Because at that point, it was no longer just about the money. It was about something deeper, something more deliberate. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't even impulsive. This had been planned. And the most unsettling part of all was that I had been there, sitting right in front of it, and didn't see it happening. I didn't rush after that. That was the difference now. Before, everything inside me wanted answers, explanations, something immediate that could bring the situation back under control. But that feeling had changed. It wasn't urgency anymore. It was clarity, a slow, controlled awareness that whatever had happened had already happened, and reacting too fast wouldn't fix it. It would only expose how much I didn't know. So instead of calling again, instead of confronting anyone, I decided to go somewhere where things couldn't be shaped by tone or behavior. The bank, not through a screen, not through a voice on the phone, in person, where details exist in records, not in explanations. The branch wasn't far. I remember the drive feeling longer than usual, not because of distance, but because of what was running through my mind. Every detail from the night before kept resurfacing, but now they weren't just memories. They were pieces, fragments of something I was starting to assemble without fully admitting it yet. I parked, sat in the car for a few seconds, then stepped out, already feeling that quiet shift in perspective that happens when you cross a line you can't go back from. Inside, everything looked normal. People waiting, conversations happening, the routine of a place where problems are handled every day. But for me, nothing about it felt routine. I approached the desk, explained the situation again, this time slower, more precise, choosing each word carefully. Not because I needed to convince them, but because I needed them to give me more than just a surface answer. The woman assisted me listen without interrupting, typing as I spoke, occasionally glancing at the screen in a way that told me she was already seeing something I hadn't yet. When I finished, she paused, just like the person on the phone had done earlier. But this time, I could see it, that slight hesitation, that moment where information is being processed before it's shared. She turned the monitor slightly, not enough for me to see everything, but enough to confirm that there was more behind what I had been told. "Sir," she said, her voice calm, controlled, "this transaction wasn't just authorized, it followed a recognized pattern." That word, pattern, didn't sit well. I asked her to explain. She hesitated again, not because she didn't know, but because she knew exactly what it meant. The system identifies behavior based on previous activity, devices, locations, timing, even the way the account is accessed. This transfer matched those patterns closely enough that it didn't trigger any alerts. I felt my jaw tighten slightly, but I didn't interrupt. I just listened, because what she was saying, in simple terms, meant something very specific. Whoever did this didn't just have access. They knew how I used it. I asked one more question, a simple one. Can you tell me where it was done from? She looked back at the screen, typed something, then stopped. Yes, she said. It was done locally. That was it. No dramatic pause. No emphasis. Just a fact. But it hit harder than anything else so far. Local. Not another city. Not another country. Not some distant point that could give me space to doubt. Close. Close enough to be within reach. Close enough to have been inside my house just hours before. I thanked her, stood up, and walked out without saying much else. Not because I didn't have more questions, but because I already had enough answers. As I stepped outside, the air felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just clearer. Because at that point, there was only one thing left that still required confirmation. And deep down, I already knew where to look. I didn't go home right away after leaving the bank. Instead, I sat in the car for a few minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, not moving, not rushing to the next step. Because at that point, going back home didn't feel like returning to a safe place anymore. It felt like going back to a scene I had misunderstood and was only now beginning to see clearly. And the more I replayed everything in my mind, the more one thing became undeniable. This wasn't something I was going to resolve with a simple question, so I chose a different approach. I called my son, not with urgency, not with anger, just a normal call. The kind of call that doesn't prepare the other person for anything serious. It rang a few times before he answered, his voice slightly distracted, like he was doing something else at the same time. "Hey," he said. "Hey." I replied, matching his tone. Calm, neutral. "You busy?" "A little." "What's up?" I paused for a second, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was deciding how much to reveal. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't about asking for the truth. It was about seeing how he handled it. "I went to the bank this morning," I said, slowly. There was a silence. Not long, but long enough. "Okay," he replied. "I had a problem with my account." Another pause. Slightly longer this time. "What kind of problem?" That question sounded normal. On the surface. It was exactly what anyone would ask. But there was something underneath it. Something too controlled, too measured, like he was choosing his reaction instead of simply having one. "A transfer," I said. "A large one." Silence again. I didn't feel it. I let it stay there, stretching just enough to force him into it. And then he spoke. "Did you call the bank?" There it was. Not surprise. Not confusion. Not concern. Direction. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask how much. He didn't ask when. He asked if I had already taken a step that would confirm everything. "I did," I answered. A small shift in his breathing. Almost imperceptible. But it was there. "And," he asked, "they said it was authorized." This time, the silence was different. It wasn't just a pause. It was wait, because that word, authorized, doesn't leave much room for interpretation. I didn't say anything else. I didn't accuse. I didn't push. I just waited. And that's when I heard it. Not in his words, but in what he didn't say. No denial. No confusion. No immediate reaction. Just a careful stillness, like someone standing in a place where one wrong step changes everything. "Maybe it's a mistake," he said finally, his voice lower than before, less certain. "Sometimes those systems, they get things wrong." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah," I said, "maybe." But at that point, I wasn't listening to what he was saying anymore. I was listening to what was missing. Because when something real happens, people react. And he didn't. I ended the call shortly after that, not giving him time to adjust, not giving him space to recover. Just enough conversation to show him where I stood without telling him how far I had already gone. And as I lowered the phone, one thing became clear in a way it hadn't before. He knew, maybe not everything, maybe not the full picture, but enough to hesitate, enough to choose his words, enough to not be surprised. And at that moment, the question was no longer something that happened. It was how far it went. I didn't call her right away after speaking to my son. In fact, I waited longer than I probably needed to, not because I was unsure, but because I understood something fundamental at that point. The moment I spoke to her, everything would shift. Up until now, I had been observing, listening, collecting small pieces without exposing how much I had already understood. But once I crossed that line, there would be no going back to silence. So I took my time, not to calm down, but to make sure that when I finally spoke, I wouldn't be reacting. I would be leading. When I finally dialed her number, my hand was steady, my voice even more so. It rang fewer times than expected before she answered, almost as if she had been anticipating the call, waiting for it in a way that didn't feel natural. "Hello," she said, her tone controlled, neutral, but not warm, not surprised either. And that alone told me more than any explanation could have. "Hi," I said calmly. "I wanted to ask you something." A brief silence followed, subtle but present, not confusion, not curiosity, just readiness. "Sure," she replied. "I went to bank today." I continued, choosing each word carefully, not rushing, not giving her anything she could use to adjust too quickly. They gave me some details about what happened. I stopped there, on purpose, because sometimes what you don't say forces the other person to reveal more than what you do. There was a pause on her end, slightly longer than before, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something different. Not fear, not panic, but calculation. "And what did they say?" she asked. That question was precise. Too precise. She didn't ask if everything was okay. She didn't pretend to be confused. She went straight to the point again, just like in her message earlier. And that confirmed something even deeper than before. She wasn't reacting to information. She was measuring how much of it I had. "They said it wasn't a breach," I replied slowly. "It was authorized, recognized access, local." This time, the silence stretched longer, and I didn't interrupt it. I let it grow, because silence, when it's real, has a way of exposing things that words try to hide. When she finally spoke, her voice was still controlled, but not as stable as before. "Well, that's strange," she said. "Maybe someone used your information." Maybe. That word lingered in the air like something that didn't belong there. Because at that point, there was no maybe left. Not really. And I think she knew that. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my eyes fixed on nothing in particular, but my attention completely focused on her voice, on the spaces between her words, on the parts she avoided instead of the ones she chose. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Maybe." Another pause, and then I added something different. Something small, but deliberate. "They also told me something else." I didn't continue. I didn't explain. I just placed a sentence there and let it sit. Because now, it wasn't about information anymore. It was about pressure. And for the first time since this all started, I felt it shift. From me to her, there was no immediate response. No quick question this time. Just a silence that felt heavier than all the others combined. And in that silence, I could almost hear the calculation happening on the other side. What did I know? How much did I know? What had the bank told me that I hadn't said yet? And that was exactly where I needed her. Waiting, thinking, adjusting, because people don't reveal themselves when they're comfortable. They reveal themselves when they feel exposed. And right then, she didn't respond immediately after I said that. In fact, for a few seconds, there was nothing on the other end of the line except silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from confusion, but the kind that comes from thinking too fast, trying to catch up to something that just moved out of control. And that was the first real shift I felt. Up until that moment, she had been ahead, measuring, guiding, keeping everything within a certain limit. But now, something had changed. The balance wasn't the same anymore. "What else did they say?" she asked finally. But this time, it wasn't the same tone. It was still controlled, still careful, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. A slight tension, a small crack, and if you weren't paying attention, you would miss it. But I wasn't missing anything anymore. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted that question to sit there for a moment longer. Because sometimes, when people ask something too quickly, it's not because they're curious. It's because they're trying to confirm something before it's too late. They said the access matched my usual behavior. I replied slowly, keeping my voice steady, almost indifferent. Same device pattern, same type of interaction. Another silence, longer this time. And then it happened. "Well, that makes sense if you were on your phone during dinner," she said. I didn't react immediately, but inside, everything stopped, because that sentence didn't belong there. Not the words themselves, not the logic, but the detail. During dinner. I had never said that. Not to her, not to my son, not to anyone. I had never mentioned when the transfer happened. I had only said it was late, that it was after they left. But I never said anything about being on my phone during dinner. That detail had never left my side of the story. And yet she used it naturally, too naturally, like someone referencing something they had seen, not something they had been told. I kept my voice steady. I didn't say I used my phone during dinner. I replied quietly. Silence. Immediate. Heavy. There was no quick recovery this time. No smooth transition. No controlled response ready to fill the gap. Just nothing. And in that nothing, everything became clear in a way that no confirmation from the bank could ever match. Because mistakes like that don't come from guessing. They come from memory, from being there, from seeing it happen. When she finally spoke again, her voice had changed. Not drastically, but enough. I mean, people usually use their phones. That's all I meant. She said quickly, try and close the space that had opened, but it was too late. Because once something real slips out, it doesn't go back in. I didn't argue. I didn't push. I didn't even correct her. Yeah, I said calmly. Maybe. And I let it go, not because I didn't have more to say, but because I didn't need to anymore. Because at that point, it wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't a possibility. It was a fact. And the most unsettling part of all wasn't that she had made a mistake. It was that she didn't even realize how much that mistake had revealed. I didn't confront her after that. That would have been the obvious move, the emotional move, the kind of reaction people expect when something finally becomes clear. But I had already understood something by then that mattered more than any immediate answer. The truth wasn't just in what had happened, it was in how it had been done. And if I moved too quickly, if I reacted without thinking, I would only get denial, confusion, and distance, not clarity, not accountability. So I chose something else. Silence. Not the same silence as before, the kind that comes from uncertainty or hesitation. This was different. This was intentional. A silence that observes instead of ignores, that waits instead of avoids. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't the one trying to catch up anymore. I was the one setting the pace. I ended the call shortly after that, without tension, without raising my voice, without giving her anything she could use to prepare herself. Just a normal ending, like nothing had changed. But everything had. When I got home, the house felt different again. Not empty, but exposed. Like I could now see things I hadn't noticed before. Small details that had always been there, but never meant anything until now. The table, the chair where she sat, the exact place where my phone had been left unattended for those few minutes that, at the time, seemed irrelevant. I walked through the house slowly, not searching for anything specific, but letting my mind connect what it needed to connect. And then I did something I should have done earlier. I checked my phone, not the bank app, not the messages, the settings, access history, security logs. device recognition. Things most people don't think about unless something goes wrong. And as I moved through those menus, step by step, I started to see something that hadn't been obvious before. A new access point. Not a completely new device, but not entirely familiar either. It didn't stand out immediately. It blended in just enough to pass as normal, just enough to not raise suspicion at first glance. But when I looked closer, when I compared timestamps, patterns, small variations, it didn't match perfectly. It was close. Too close. Like someone had been trying to mirror my behavior. Without fully understanding it, I leaned back in the chair, the phone still in my hand, and for the first time since the morning, I allowed myself to feel something stronger than clarity. Not anger. Not yet, but something sharper. Recognition. Because this wasn't impulsive. It wasn't random. It wasn't even desperate. It was calculated. And calculation leaves traces. I took a screenshot, then another, not because I needed proof for myself, but because I understood something important. At some point, this would need to be shown, not explained, not argued, shown, and that changes everything. I placed the phone on the table slowly, my eyes still fixed on the screen even after it went dark, because at that point, the situation had shifted completely. This was no longer about finding out what happened. That part was already done. Now it was about deciding what to do with it. And more importantly, how. I didn't act that same day. That would have been too simple and too predictable. By that point, I had already understood that whatever had been done wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a moment of weakness or a sudden mistake. It had structure, timing, awareness. And things like that don't fall apart under pressure. They fall apart under exposure. So instead of confronting them immediately, I decided to give it space. Not distance, space. The kind that makes people believe everything is still under control. I went through the rest of the day normally, ate at the usual time, moved around the house the same way I always did, even responded to a message from my son later that evening as if nothing had changed, because that was part of it too. If they felt safe, if they believed I hadn't connected the pieces yet, they wouldn't tighten up, they wouldn't prepare. They would stay exactly where I needed them to be. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was restless, but because my mind was working in a different way now. Not replaying what had happened, but organizing what would happen next. I didn't need more evidence. I didn't need more confirmation. What I needed was the right moment. The kind of moment where everything becomes undeniable, not through accusation, but through presence. The next morning, I sent a message. Simple. Come over tonight. I want to have dinner again. No explanation. No urgency. No emotion. Just an invitation. I watched the message sit there for a while before it was read. And when it was, the response didn't come immediately. Minutes passed. Then more. And that delay told me more than any quick reply could have. Because hesitation like that doesn't come from confusion. It comes from thinking, from weighing something, from asking questions that aren't being said out loud. Eventually, my son replied, "Tonight?" "Yes," I answered. Another pause. Then, "Okay." No enthusiasm, no curiosity, no follow-up, just acceptance. And that was enough, because at that point, I knew they would come, not because they wanted to, but because they needed to know how much I knew. The rest of the day moved slowly, but not in the same way as before. This time, it wasn't uncertainty stretching the hours. It was anticipation, controlled, focused. Every small action I took had intention behind it. I prepared the table again, almost exactly like the night before. Same arrangement, same positions, same routine. Except this time, nothing about it was normal. Before they arrived, I took my phone and placed it on the table again. Same spot, same angle. But this time, it wasn't just sitting there. It was recording, not video, audio, clear enough to capture everything that would be said. Not because I expected them to confess immediately, but because I understood something deeper. When people are placed in a situation they don't fully control, they reveal more than they intend to. And tonight, they wouldn't be in control. When I heard the car pull up outside, I didn't rush to the door. I stayed where I was for a second, letting that sound settle into the moment. Because that sound wasn't just their arrival. It was the beginning of the end of something they thought they had gotten away with. I walked to the door calmly, opened it, and greeted them the same way I had the night before. No tension, no accusation, no change. But inside, everything was different. And this time, I was ready. They walked in the same way they had the night before. Same steps, same small gestures, same attempt to make everything feel ordinary. My son gave me a brief nod as he crossed the doorway. Not quite a smile, not quite distant, just enough to pass as normal. And she followed right behind him, carrying that same composed expression, controlled, measured, as if nothing in the world had shifted. But this time, I wasn't looking at what they were trying to show. I was looking at what they were trying to hide. "Smells good," my son said, glancing toward the kitchen. "Yeah," I replied calmly. "Thought we could do it again." No one questioned it. No one asked why. And that by itself said more than any conversation could have. Because when something feels unusual, people usually react to it. They ask. They hesitate. They try to understand. But they didn't. They accepted it too quickly. Like they already knew this wasn't just another dinner. We sat down at the table, the same positions as before. I made sure of that, not by forcing it, but by guiding it naturally, letting the routine place them exactly where I needed them to be. My phone was already there, resting quietly in the same spot, screen dark, invisible in its purpose, but active in a way they couldn't see. Conversation started slowly, almost carefully. Small topics, safe subjects. The kind of talk people use when they're trying to maintain control over a situation that feels unstable underneath. My son spoke a little less than usual. She spoke just enough. Not too much, not too little. Balanced, controlled, but there were cracks. Small ones. The kind you only notice when you're not distracted by appearances. The way she avoided looking directly at the table for too long. The way my son kept adjusting his posture, like he couldn't quite settle into the chair. The pauses between responses. Slightly longer than normal. Not obvious, but present. And I let it continue. I didn't rush anything. I didn't steer the conversation. I didn't bring up the bank, the call, the message, or anything that could shift the tone too quickly. Because pressure, when applied too fast, creates resistance, but pressure, when it builds slowly, creates exposure. At some point, I leaned back slightly and picked up my glass, taking a small sip before speaking again, my voice calm, almost casual. "I went back to the bank today," I said. The effect was immediate, not dramatic, not loud, but real. My son's hand paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing his movement. She didn't look up, but her attention shifted completely. "Oh," she said, her tone light, but just a little tighter than before. "What do they say?" There was again the same question, not concern, not confusion. Information control. I placed the glass back down slowly, letting the silence sit for just a moment longer than necessary before answering. They gave me more details. I stopped there, again, on purpose, because I didn't need to say more yet, and that silence did the work for me. They didn't eat, not immediately. They didn't speak either, just a brief stillness that passed between them, almost invisible, but not enough. I looked at both of them, not aggressively, not accusingly, just present, just aware. They confirmed something important. I added. Now the air had changed, completely. Because at that point, it was no longer a normal dinner with an unusual topic. It was something else, something they couldn't walk away from without knowing what was coming next. And for the first time since it started, they weren't ahead anymore. They were waiting. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I didn't even change my expression. because at that point, emotion wasn't necessary anymore. Everything that needed to happen would happen through clarity, through presence, through something far more difficult to argue with an accusation. I reached slowly for my phone, the same one that had been sitting on the table the entire time, unnoticed in its purpose but central to everything that was about to unfold. My fingers moved calmly, almost casually, as I unlocked the screen and tapped a few times, not rushing, not creating any sense of urgency, because this wasn't a reveal meant to shock them. It was a reveal meant to corner them. I asked them to show me something specific. I said, my tone steady, controlled, as I turned the screen slightly toward them. Not just a transaction, but how it happened. Neither of them spoke, but they leaned in, not visibly, not in a way that would stand out to anyone else, but enough to confirm that whatever confidence they had been holding onto was starting to shift. On the screen were the access details. Not complicated, not technical enough to confuse, just clear enough to be understood. Timestamps, device patterns, location markers, simple information arranged in a way that left very little room for interpretation. I let it sit there for a moment before continuing. They told me it matched my behavior. I said, almost perfectly. Silence. Heavy now. No small talk left. No safe ground to return to. Almost, I repeated quietly. That word mattered. Because almost means something didn't fit. Something was close, but not exact. And that difference was everything. I tapped the screen once more, bringing up the detail I had noticed earlier. The slight variation. The one that wouldn't matter to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But impossible to ignore once seen. This part, I said, pointing to it calmly, doesn't match. I didn't explain it. I didn't need to, because I wasn't showing it for myself. I was showing it for them. And their reaction told me everything. My son looked at the screen for a second longer than necessary, then leaned back slightly, his posture tightening, his eyes shifting away as if looking somewhere else could reduce what was in front of him. But it didn't. And she didn't move. Not at first. Her eyes stayed on the screen, fixed, focused, calculating. And then, just for a moment, they flickered. Not fear, not panic, recognition. That's when I knew. Not because of what they said, but because of what they couldn't control. I locked the phone and placed it back on the table, exactly where it had been before, removing it from the center of the moment as if it no longer needed to be there, because the proof had already done its job. I'm not asking what happened, I said calmly, looking at both of them, my voice steady, grounded in something that didn't need to rise to be heard. I already know enough. Another silence. But this one was different. This one wasn't filled with calculation. It was filled with weight. The kind that comes when something can no longer be avoided, no longer redirected, no longer softened. And still, I didn't push. Because the truth, when it's real, doesn't need to be forced. It surfaces. On its own. And right then, it was about to. No one spoke right away after I said that. The air didn't just feel heavy, it felt still, like everything in the room had stopped moving at the same time. Even the smallest sounds, the faint clink of cutlery, the distant noise from outside, seemed to disappear into silence that settled between us. And in that silence, something changed, not on the surface, but underneath, because when there are no more words to hide behind, people are left with themselves. And that's when the truth starts to press through. My son was the first to move, but not in a way that resolved anything. He shifted in his chair, his hands coming together briefly, as if he was about to speak, then stopping halfway through the motion. His eyes avoided mine, then returned, then moved away again. It wasn't guilt in the way people expect it to look. It was conflict, the kind that happens when someone is standing between two versions of themselves and doesn't know which one they're about to become. She didn't move like that. She stayed still, too still. Her posture remained controlled, her expression neutral, almost composed in a way that would seem calm to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But calm isn't the same as steady. And what I saw in her wasn't steadiness. It was effort. The kind of effort it takes to hold something in place when it's already starting to fall apart. "You're making assumptions," she said finally. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. It stayed exactly where she wanted it. But something about it had changed. It wasn't guiding anymore. It wasn't controlling the direction of the conversation. It was defending a position that had already weakened. "I'm not," I replied quietly. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. I didn't list details or repeat anything that had already been shown, because I didn't need to. The space between what had been revealed and what had been said was already enough. She exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, then leaned back slightly, creating a small physical distance from the table from me, from the moment itself. And then she did something that, until that point, she had avoided completely. She shifted the focus. "This isn't what you think," she said. That sentence always comes before something real, not because it clarifies anything, but because it prepares the ground for something that can't be fully denied. I looked at her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with attention, full attention, the kind that doesn't interrupt, doesn't rush, doesn't react too soon, because I understood something now that I hadn't before. The truth doesn't come out when you demand it. It comes out when there's nowhere left for it to go. My son finally spoke then, his voice lower, less certain than before. "Maybe we should just explain," he said, glancing briefly in her direction before looking down again. "Explain. Not deny. Not question. Explain." And that word changed everything, because it confirmed something I had already felt but hadn't heard yet. This wasn't something they were going to pretend didn't happen anymore. This was something they were about to try to justify. She turned her head slightly toward him, just enough to acknowledge what he'd said, but not enough to fully accept it. And in that small movement there was tension, not between me and them. Between them, a fracture, a difference in how far each of them was willing to go. And that was the moment I had been waiting for. Because when people involved in the same action stop moving as one, the truth doesn't just appear. It breaks through. And right then, it started to. The silence didn't break all at once. It shifted slowly, like something being forced out of place that no longer fit. No one stood up. No one raised their voice. But something inside the room had already crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And the first sign of that came from him. "I didn't know it would go this far," my son said. Not loud, not dramatic, but clear. And that sentence didn't deny anything. It didn't question what had happened. It acknowledged it. She turned toward him immediately, her control slipping just enough to show something underneath. Not panic, but resistance. The kind that comes when someone realizes they're no longer the one guiding the situation. "That's not what we agreed," she said, her voice still measured but sharper now, less contained. Agreed. That word settled into the space between us like something solid, because it confirmed something even more important than the action itself. This wasn't a mistake. This was a plan. I didn't interrupt. I didn't react. I let them continue, because at that point, they weren't speaking to me anymore. They were speaking through each other. "I told you we should wait," my son said, his voice tightening slightly, his eyes still avoiding mine. "I said we needed to be careful." "And I told you we didn't have time," she replied, her tone controlled, but now carrying something more direct, more exposed. The situation wasn't going to fix itself. Situation. Another word. Another piece. And with each word, the shape of it became clearer. This wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was justified in their minds. I leaned back slightly, not to distance myself, but to give them space to continue revealing what they hadn't planned to say out loud. "What situation?" I asked calmly. That question didn't come from confusion. It came from direction. Because once people start explaining, they rarely stop halfway. My son hesitated. His hands pressed together again, his posture closing in slightly, like he was trying to contain something that no longer fit inside. She had debt, he said finally. Simple, direct, incomplete, but enough. She didn't interrupt him this time. She didn't correct him, which told me something even more important than the words themselves. It was true. How much? I asked. He didn't answer immediately, but she did. More than we could handle, she said, her voice steady again, but now stripped of the earlier control. And no one was going to help. There it was. Not an apology, not remorse, just justification. A reason built to support what had already been done. So you decided to take it, I said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating it. She held my gaze for the first time since the conversation had shifted. We were going to fix it, she said. We just needed time. Time, that word always comes after the decision has already been made. I nodded slowly, not agreeing, just acknowledging what had been said. And you didn't think to ask, I added quietly. This time, neither of them answered, because that question doesn't have a comfortable answer, not a real one. The silence returned, but not the same silence as before. This one wasn't hiding anything. This one had already revealed everything that mattered, and in that moment, something inside me settled. Not anger, not even disappointment in the way people usually describe it. Something quieter, something final. Because at that point, it wasn't about understanding what they did anymore. It was about understanding who they were willing to become to do it. No one said anything after that. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to justify, nothing left to reshape into something easier to accept. The truth had already taken its place in the room, quiet, solid, undeniable. And for the first time since this all started, I wasn't searching for anything anymore. Not answers, not reactions, not even closure in the way people usually expect it. Because sometimes closure isn't something you receive. It's something you decide. I looked at both of them, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a kind of clarity that doesn't need to prove itself. My son still couldn't hold my gaze for long. She could, but not in the same way as before. The control she had carried into that room was gone now, replaced by something else. Not regret, not exactly. Just the awareness that whatever had been done couldn't be undone by explanation. I'm not going to argue about this, I said finally, my voice steady, quiet, but firm in a way that didn't leave space for negotiation. And I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. Neither of them interrupted, because they knew this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a line. I gave you access to my life, I continued slowly. Not just my house, not just my time, but my trust. That word stayed there for a moment. Trust. Because that's what this had really been about from the beginning, even if it only became clear at the end. And what you did with it, I added, not finishing the sentence completely, because I didn't need to. The rest was already understood. My son finally looked up then, just for a second, his eyes carrying something closer to what people would call guilt. But even that felt incomplete, because guilt, when it's real, comes with responsibility. And he still hadn't taken it. She remained still, watching, waiting, as if there was still something left to negotiate. But there wasn't. Not anymore. I've already contacted the bank again, I said calmly without raising my tone. And I've reported everything. That was the moment it shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. My son's posture changed instantly. Tension rising through his shoulders, his breath catching slightly before he could control it. She didn't move as much, but her eyes did. That quick flicker again. That small, uncontrollable reaction that always appears when reality finally lands. You didn't have to do that, she said. There it was. Not denial, not apology. Consequence. Yes, I replied. I did. Silence followed again. But this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt finished, because once a line is crossed and acknowledged, there's nothing left to hold in place. I'm not going to chase this, I continued. I'm not going to argue. And I'm not going to sit here pretend we can go back to what this was. I paused for a second, not to think, but to let the words settle. But I'm also not going to carry this for you. That was it. No raised voice. No dramatic ending. Just a boundary. Clear. Final. I stood up slowly from the table. Not in a rush, not in anger, just done. The room felt different now. Not tense. Not unstable. Just quiet in a way that didn't ask for anything else. They didn't stop me. They didn't try. And that, more than anything else, confirmed what I had already understood. Because when people know they've crossed a line that can't be undone, they don't fight it. They recognize it. I walked toward the door and opened it, the same way I had the night before. But this time, it wasn't an invitation. It was an exit for them. And as they stepped out, one after the other, without words, without resolution, without anything left to say, I realized something that stayed with me long after the door closed. It wasn't the money that had been taken. It was the illusion. And once that's gone, there's nothing left to recover. If you ever trusted someone and felt that trust break in a way you didn't expect, then you already understand that some losses go far beyond money. Stories like this aren't just about what was taken, but about what was revealed. And sometimes, seeing the truth clearly is the only way to move forward, without carrying what was never yours to hold. If this story made you think, or reminded you of something real, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that need to be heard the most.